Hi, Elise Dewsberry here again with the fifth in my video blog about how to get no feedback from Elise. And I've talked so far in these chats about the theme of your musical, the lead of your musical, the plot of your musical, and I've started the last time I started on a series that I'm doing on structure, and I'm breaking that up into a few different areas. Talked about narrative point of view last time. This time I want to talk about two things, flashbacks and framing devices. They're similar but not quite the same, and I want to talk about what some of the differences are and why you might use them or how you might use them in your storytelling. So to start with a flashback, obviously a flashback is in terms of when you're doing a show with flashbacks, your main story takes place in whatever your present time period is. And then periodically during the show, you will have occasional flashbacks that will tell us some of the backstory about the musical that happened before. Now, it's also possible within the same kind of framework that these could be flash forwards, they could be memories, they could be fantasies. But the important thing is that your main story is taking place in present time, and these little flights of fancy, be they flashbacks, flash forwards, fantasies, memories, these are things that are meant to enhance the storytelling of the present tense story. So the present tense story remains the main story that we're following, and the arc of the lead character of the main story remains the most important thing. And these other elements are meant to enhance that, move the story along, give us more information as we need it as we go along. A couple of samples of shows that do this. For instance, Chorus Line. We learn more about each of the hopefuls on the chorus line by having them tell us stories about their past. In Nine, for instance, there are lots also of stories that are happening that we learn more about the lead character in Nine based on stories that we hear in particular from his childhood that are aimed to fill in some of the information about who he is as a person that helps us understand why he's doing what he is in the current time period. There's also an instance, for instance, in Sweeney Todd, although in Sweeney Todd it really only happens, uh, this is another sample of it when a character is telling a past tense story. So when Mrs. Lovett is telling Sweeney Todd about what happened to Lucy while he was gone, as she tells the story comes alive, and the past tense story, we get to witness it while the story is being told. That's another use of a flashback. But again, the most important thing is that the main storyline is what's taking place in the present time. The flashbacks, flash forwards, memories, whatever, are meant to enhance the story. The other arena, a framing device. Now, a framing device is different in that usually a framing device is what bookends the main part of your story. So once again, the main part of your story is taking place not as part of the framing device, but often the framing device is what's in the present tense. This is one way of doing it, where someone says, oh, I want to tell you a story, or we'll see a little bit of a scene between some people, and then they'll say, oh, that reminds me of, and then the story, the main story that you're telling will unfold, but it will be a past tense story that has been triggered and set up by the framing device. And the framing device often usually is much shorter, and it doesn't have anywhere near as much stage time because it isn't your main story, even though it is what is in the present tense. And it will launch the story, and almost always will then wrap up the story at the end. So it's gonna happen at least twice, to launch the story at the beginning of the show and to wrap it up at the end. And often it will make other appearances, two or three other appearances, maybe at the end of Act One and the beginning of Act Two, or at other important moments. The framing device will come back. One sample of that might be The Princess Bride, the movie of The Princess Bride. It also happens in the novel, where the framing device is the grandfather reading the bedtime story to his grandson. But the main story, is the story of the Princess Bride, but it is told within the context of this framing device. Another one might be a Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, where he begins the show when he's in jail and is contemplating the fact that he's about to be executed for murder, and he tells us the entire story of how he got here by sending us all the way back to the beginning and taking us through the story. And he comes in periodically to remind us that that is what he's doing. That's similar in a way to a narrative point of view, but it's a narrative point of view that's employing a framing device. Now, some of the things that you're thinking about that you would want to think about if you want to employ either of these techniques would be how many flashbacks should you have, for instance, if you're going to use flashbacks to help illuminate the journey of your lead character. I might point you to the rule of three. It's most often referred to when you're talking about comedy, jokes, and things like that, that you use the rule of three, but it works with just about anything. So in order to really, I think, to use flashbacks effectively, it can be best to use it at least 3 times. You can do more, but 3 is useful. Although a caveat is, I would say you could use it just once, but I don't think it's very useful to use it only twice. Because once can be just a very particular event, an important moment, like we need this one flashback in order to illuminate one aspect that is going to clarify everything for us, and we only need it once, and it would probably happen very late in the day, maybe just before, right near the end of the second act, and it's the thing that solves everything for us. As soon as you have 2 flashbacks, now you're starting to set up an expectation. You're leading me to believe that I'm in a story that is being told with flashbacks, and so I'm going to be looking for a 3rd one. If there's only one and it's late in the day and it's not just lone in the first act, then I can see it as a revelatory event. But if it happens in the first act, I'm going to expect to see it again another time, and if it happens twice, I'm really going to expect to see it 3 times. So that's something to consider. Same thing with the framing device. Should it be, I think it should at least be at the beginning and the end. Should it pop up in other times? It could, it doesn't have to. But it's, for instance, if you end the first act with it, you probably need to start the second act with it again. So these are things to consider. How often is this going to happen? I think you also need to think about triggers, especially if you're doing flashbacks. I think flashbacks, but also going back again to the framing device, if that's what's going to happen. I think you need to think about what is happening in your main story that triggers the change. It can't just be random where we're in one scene and suddenly we're in a flashback. And I think the trigger, although the trigger doesn't have to be exactly the same if you're doing a series of flashbacks, the trigger doesn't have to be the same every time, but there should be something similar, like every time the person gets angry, it triggers a flashback. Every time they drop something on the floor, it triggers a flashback. Or I think it's worth considering what are those triggers and how can you make the best use of the triggers. Now, the other thing, though, that I think is even more important is to think about, why are you doing this? Why are you choosing to use flashbacks or framing devices? There's nothing at all wrong with using them. They complicate your storytelling a little bit. They can also make it lots more interesting, but you need to think about why you're doing it. So ask yourself, are you using these because you feel the need to fill in expositional material or background material that the audience can't get any other way? If that is your only reason, because you're trying to figure out how to get in expository material, I don't think that's a good enough reason. I think, for instance, if you're filling us in with expository information about a character, it should be important to the character to remember that moment in order for them to change, for something to happen that makes a change for them. If their story is just sort of on hold while you give us some background information that we need in order to understand the next thing, I think that's less effective dramatically. I think that's lazy book writing, to use it simply for that. So if you're going to employ these devices, I would encourage you to employ them because you feel that it is essential to the telling of the story of your lead character. It makes a difference to your lead character. Now, the one other thing that I would talk about if you're using one of these devices is I would really encourage you to outline the stories separately. So outline the framing device and outline the main story. Before and then figure out, once they work separately, then put them together and figure out how to trigger them and how often it should happen. But and this leads me to another area, which is with a framing device, it could be as simple as someone comes forward and says, well, here I am in a sorry state, like in Gentleman's Guide. Let me tell you how I got here. And that's all you really need the framing device for, is to kick off the story and then to wrap it up at the end. But I would encourage you to think that a framing device is more effective if within the framing device itself there's a little story with a beginning, middle, end, that where something different will happen because of the reliving of the story, or something is at stake. Even with Gentleman's Guide, it's, he's about to be executed. So there's a reason for him to tell his story. He's writing his memoirs. Um, but I think it's useful, for instance, maybe a character is about to make a huge decision, and in the framing device at the beginning of the show, they're on the verge of this big decision, and they relive their life up to this moment, or a series of events up until this moment, in order to affect the decision that they're going to make. And when we come back to the framing device at the end, they make that decision and decide, yes, they're going to do this, or no, they're not going to do whatever it was that they were waiting on. But that means that the framing device has its own little story. And I would encourage you, if you're using a framing device, to consider that. And for flashbacks, I would also encourage you to outline the beginning, middle, end of the story of the flashbacks, so that then you can look at the overall story, which you're also outlining for your main character, and figure out which part of this flashback is going to be important at which point of the story. Rather than just thinking, oh, we'll have a flashback here, I guess it could be this. I would encourage you to really outline the story that you're telling in the flashbacks and try to figure out, now, how could this be broken up? Here's the story that I want to tell. Here's the information. Could that be broken up into 3 flashbacks, 4 flashbacks, 1 flashback? But I would really encourage you to outline these different things separately and then figure out how to intercut them. And then they have their own integrity. And you can figure out different ways to break them up. So that's talking about framing devices and flashbacks. Next time around, we'll talk a little bit more about some other structural elements. Thanks for listening today, and best of luck in getting no feedback from me.